In this video, I'm going to walk you through query 1 for the root beer database project. So you'll see on the screen the problem description. So it says that I'm very interested in how different brands are performing, and I want to know how many of the bottles, not the cans, of each brand have been sold in total. We want to create a query. Notice that it says that the final query should have two fields, and here are the names of the fields: brand name and the number of bottles. And then once we get there, we're going to do some sorting in descending order when we're done. Okay. Now, whenever I handle a query, the first thing I do is I look at the relationships view, so I can understand the tables and the various fields that I'll need in my query. In this case, we can search through and we can see brand name and find out that, hey, brand name is actually a field in the root beer brand table, and it's exactly what I want. We can also search through and say, okay, number of bottles. Where's that in the database? Well, it actually doesn't exist in the database. That's a field that we're going to need to calculate and then name ourselves. We'll get to that in a second. Now, is there anything else based off of this problem description that we probably need to look for? It says that we want only bottles and not cans of each brand. And so we're going to have to figure out, okay, well, where is that information? We can search through our tables and we can look where is it designated that that something that's sold is a bottle and not a can. And we can actually find out that in the root beer table, container field has that information for us, bottles and cans. So now that we've looked at those, I'm going to create a query. We go to the Create tab, go to the Query Design, and pop up the Query Designer. And we have an option for a number of different tables that we can draw on. If you remember, we'll need our root beer brand table, and we're going to need our root beer table. As we move along, it's possible we might need other tables, but for now, those seem like they'll do it. If, for example, you don't have a table that you need, you can drag it over from the side, or right-click and select Show Table. Or, if you have other tables that you don't need, then you can also right-click on these and remove the table from your query. It doesn't remove it from the database, just from this query. So first thing, we know we need the brand name. Let's either click and drag this down, double-click and bring it down, or if it was not here, we can also select, for example, the name of the field that we want from the drop-down menu. I prefer just double-clicking and bringing these down. The next thing we are going to need to deal with is the container. Okay? So if we run this query just with brand name and container, we can see that in our database there are 6,430 records of a product. So we've purchased 6,430 products, and some of them are various brands, some of them are bottles, some of them are cans. But you'll notice also that we don't want the cans. We only want bottles to show up. So the way that we eliminate records from our final query list, like these cans of A&W, the way that we eliminate that is that we add criteria. So for our container field, if we're to go to the criteria row and type bottle, you'll notice that Access, if we exit that field, or that spot, Access will put it in quotes because container happens to be a text field, and text is supposed to be surrounded by quotes. If we select bottle there and run the query, now we are only returning containers that are bottles. We've now eliminated all of the cans that our company has ever purchased. So almost 1,000 of those. We're down to 5,436 records. The next thing we need to figure out is, how do we add up the number of bottles? So for example, you can see here that we've got some root beer bottles that are by brand A&W. Okay, here's one, here's a second one, here's a third one, and we can just go down the row and we could count those up and get the number of A&W bottles, and so on and so on. Looks like there's some other A&W bottles that were purchased at a different time, and so we need to go through carefully and we could add all of those up. It would take a really long time for us to do that manually. There's 5,400 records for us to go through. Fortunately, Access provides us with a number of queries that allow us to, in our queries, to aggregate down a column. So we have a bunch of fields that allow us for numerical data, which we don't have in this case, to do things like add numerical data up, count things up, average them, take the minimum and maximum. We can do all of those things, which is nice. Now for text data, we can also count text data. So for example, we could count, and the count function says, oh, okay, if there's a record here that matches our criteria, that counts as 1. If there's another record, that counts as another. If there's another record, that counts as a third. And that's exactly what we want to do here. We want to find the total number of bottles, and so we were going to count. Now to access those aggregate functions, we will turn on the totals row, this big capital sigma button on our toolbar. When we turn on that totals row down here, by default we will add grouping. Grouping is useful for getting rid of duplicates, and that's shown in another query or in another video. But it also allows us to have access to these aggregate functions, the ones that we talked about, and a few others that we won't cover in this class. In this class, you may need to know sum, average, min, max, count, and where. Now, where isn't really an aggregate function, but it's talked about in another video. Now, whenever possible, I always try to use the count function on a field that is not blank. Sometimes this isn't possible, but if a field can be blank, then it can throw off our counts and make them inaccurate. So if possible, I try to count a field that can't be blank. And by definition, keys, primary keys, cannot be blank. So I'm going to use this root beer ID field because it's a key field and I know it won't be blank. I could have used others in this problem, but I want to count this field. So I'm going to bring down root beer ID and change the field to count. Now, as we run this query, we'll now see that our results are being aggregated. We now have this field that Access is calling count of root beer ID. It's auto-naming that temporarily. And we've got 80 A&W root beer bottles. For AJ Stevens root beer, there are 279, and so forth. All right. Now we have two things, well, 3 or 4 things left that we need to take care of. The first one is that our query, our final query, is only supposed to contain 2 fields. And we have 3 fields. We have brand name, container, and count of root beer ID. Well, we really don't need container. We only want to use it for the criteria. So we can't delete it, or else we would no longer have that criteria in effect. But what we can do is we can hide it by unchecking the show box here on the show row. And that doesn't change anything in the underlying query other than it doesn't show that field. Okay, so now we're down to 2. That's good. The next part is the number of bottles should be the name of our other field. Well, we have a field that really represents the number of bottles, but it's not named the number of bottles. So here's how we change that. For any of our fields, and this is the one that's showing here, I'm going to zoom in so we can see what's going on. For any of our fields, we can rename any of them with a different name. When we want to do that, we go to the beginning of the field name, we type in what we want the new name for the field to be, and we type the colon character. So behind the scenes, Access is still using root beer ID. We're just giving that field a different name. And if we run this query, now that field with its appropriate name shows up. Be very careful. Capitalization matters. Spaces matter. The grader is very picky. Type in exactly what you need to. The one thing that we haven't done, 2 things actually, but one thing we haven't done is we haven't done sorting. So we need to sort this list in descending order by the number of bottles. In our query designer, there is a sort row that allows us to sort in ascending or descending order. The way that sorting works is Access starts on the left-hand field, and if any of them say sorted, it starts and sorts by the first one that it comes to. In this field, there's only one field that is marked for sorting, and so we will only sort by this field in descending order. But if there were multiple fields, the first field that's used is the one that's to the left. All right, so now we're sorting in descending order. We're very close to the final query, but we're not quite there. What we need to do is we can check our checklist, and you'll notice for query 1, we should have 2 fields. Good, we've got that. We should have 22 records. Good, we have that. And record 2 should be the brand Gales. All right, good, we have that. The problem is we're not exactly right yet. Okay, so even the checklist doesn't 100% guarantee that we're going to get full points. We're very close. The conceptual problem with our query here is that we are including all root beer that we've ever purchased, including those that are still in our vending machines ready for sale. But the problem has asked us for how many of our bottles have been sold. Well, that's a different question. And so conceptually, here's what we need to do. If we go back to our relationship view, if we are to add the transaction table to this query, then it will only include records that belong, of root beers and bottles, that belong on a transaction. And transactions are the ones that have been sold. So we need to include the transaction table here. Simply by adding that in, we'll change the numbers in our results just a little bit, and we will get the right answer. Except we didn't take into account one thing. In the instructions, it says that we need to take, in this query, we only want to return results for those root beers that are currently offered. We may have some root beers in our database that are no longer offered, that we don't sell anymore for whatever reason. Maybe we can't get them from our supplier. Maybe we decided that we can't make money off of them. And so you'll notice that in the root beer brand table, that there is a currently offered field. And we'll bring this into our query. If you were to look in the root beer brand table, you can go and see that this currently offered field is actually a yes/no field. And there happens to be one root beer in here that we are not currently offering. That one happens to be the keg. So it may not make any change to our results, but we should, for future queries, we should make sure that we have a criteria on this. And so for yes/no fields, this isn't text, this is just a simple binary value 10 yes/no, and access for criteria for yes/no fields, we simply type a yes. And so that will allow us to get the correct answer for this query. Now again, we don't want to show this field, and so we're going to uncheck this one, and it no longer shows. Now, one thing that we would want to be careful is if we had duplicates in here, we might need to switch this over to where, and that's discussed in other videos on when you might need to use where. In this case, it doesn't actually make any difference because we don't have any duplicates in here. So whether we're using where or whether we're using group by, we should have the same number of records and then the same values in here. It's probably best to use where since we're not using it for anything but the criteria, and change it to where. And that's query 1.